cities, we're going to have a conversation about the most important creation that humankind has created over the last 5,000 years, but also a deeply confounded one. Most of us believe that cities are part of the challenge. But look at this dramatic creation behind you, the city of Amman. Yet, most of us feel that cities are the greatest problems that we have. They're full of slums, disease, problems of poverty. And, you know, people from Geneva believe this is the worst city in the world for traffic. But compete with this. Traffic congestion is a dramatic problem across the world. So also is political instability, problems of feeding people in cities because cities don't produce food. And of course, economic fragility, especially in cities of South Asia. And sometimes when things go bad, you have violence. And cities can become places where violence becomes endemic. And then, of course, they do other difficult things. They concentrate poverty and riches in one place, which means that they're rather difficult to plan for. And sometimes they're very difficult to manage. Some of you can remember this experience from Cairo not so long ago. But I will tell you a short story of how this dramatic change that we've seen has emerged. In the 1950s, just when the United Nations was created, the world population was about 2.5 billion. Of that, 750 million people lived in cities, most of them in Europe and in the United States. And then suddenly, if we jump to the future, roughly where we are today, you find a dramatic difference. The world is covered with a landscape of urban areas, many of them in places where we did not have million cities before. We now have a population of 2.9 billion living in cities. Half the world's population lives in cities at the current point of time. But the more interesting fact is that 2/3, about 60% of the world economy, 30 trillion, actually comes from cities. So this is the core driving force, the economic force that draws people into urban environments. And if we look forward to 2030, we find an even more dramatic change. 5 billion people, all the people on the planet in the 1950s, living in cities and an economic size of 90 trillion. It is this tremendous shift that we've seen, which talks about a change as people come to cities, especially in Asia, and very important in the next few decades or so in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a dynamic that is actually going to change the world that we've seen in less than 120 years. But of course, the great opportunity that comes with this is that with this amount of energy, with this amount of growth and employment that we can create, we can actually deal with 3 endemic problems of the current age. The first, of course, is the end of extreme poverty. That is within our grasp, if you're able to grasp and grapple with the challenges of urban development. And then finally, the very interesting challenge of dealing with climate change and disaster risk reduction. If we're able to bring these things together, cities give us the opportunity to do this quite effectively. However, in spite of this dramatic growth, employment, and all the nice things that we see, cities bring with them a number of challenges. The most important ones, of course, are environmental challenges of air pollution, water pollution, and of course, extensive use of resources. And then the other thing they do, because they concentrate so much of economic activity and population, is cities attract risk. They concentrate risk, whether it's of natural hazards. This is an image from Katrina in New Orleans, or of course, something that's very close to our hearts in India, something that happened 30 years ago. The largest industrial accident in the world in the city of Bhopal, or more recently, what we've seen in Fukushima in Japan. So this concentration of risk is one of the greatest challenges that we face in terms of our future development and the way that the world will actually work itself out. And why does that happen? That happens because, as human beings, we tend to live and settle in areas that are highly risk-prone, along coastlines, along rivers, along fault zones. Why? Because these are the areas that are most fertile, where we have the most water, and hence historically have been most productive. But of course, it's difficult then to relocate ourselves from them. We are actually tied down to these places. And inside those places, we find another very interesting challenge. If we take the poor and vulnerable of the world, they typically live in areas which are along hill slopes or inside river valleys, inside urban centers. And that means, of course, that they're tremendously at risk. Hundreds of millions of people in the global south especially are at risk because of the locations they live. They don't choose to live there. They have no other choice because it's too expensive for them to live in any other kinds of place. So what does that do? That takes all of this grand development that we have, the growth, the employment, and it puts all of that at risk. Because what we've seen happening is an increasing exposure and vulnerability of large populations, and the risks themselves, especially for climate change, are becoming more intense and they're becoming more frequent, like this example that you can see here from the Philippines. So the challenge for us is to take all of these three things together, development, risk, and climate change, and find effective solutions that actually deal with them simultaneously, side by side. Next year, in March, many heads of states from across the world are going to come to a place in Japan called Sendai. Sendai is a place that was impacted in 2011 by a horrible tsunami and a very serious nuclear accident. We hope the memory of that and the recovery that we've seen will give the heads of state the strength to actually sign off on a remarkable improvement on our disaster risk reduction framework. This is a difficult question. It's difficult for governments at this point of time, but we think that this may actually be possible, and cities themselves are at the center of this challenge. Simultaneously, over this year, we've seen the International Protocol, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looking at questions of climate change. And the story from that also is rather difficult and disturbing. We have clear scientific evidence today which shows that if we do not take action in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to be seriously challenged by a situation to which our children will not be able to adapt to. And this is true not only of smaller places, but it's also true of the great cities of the world, which are full of technology, riches, a tremendous amount of resources. They are all at risk. It might be 10 years between what will happen to Dar es Salaam and what may happen in London and Shanghai. But effectively, if we do not stand together on this question, if we do not take action now, we have a very serious challenge. The death of cities and the decay of cities has happened all throughout history. But I can tell you from having seen this in many locations across the world, conflict and the destruction of human settlements are terrible things to witness. We do not want to visit that either upon ourselves or our children. The good news, of course, is that we can actually transform cities, existing ones. Remember Berlin? I remember it before the wall came down. Or, more interesting, cities in the global south, especially in East Asia, South Asia, and now in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, in which more than 2/3 of the city is yet to be built. The opportunity to build resilient and sustainable cities is real. It can be realized in the next 20 or 30 years as this tremendous wave of urbanization runs across the world. So what we have today is the opportunity of a new global compact. It is called the Sustainable Development Goals, goals that actually bring together all people of all countries. And one of the most important ones we think for the next 50 years or so is the urban sustainable goal, which, and I can read it to you, is make cities and human settlements, that means cities and villages, inclusive, safe, productive, resilient, and sustainable. If we are actually able to reach out on this next year at the UN, I think we can make a dramatic change. How are we going to make this possible? The most important reason why people come to cities is very simple. They come for work. We have to give them adequate employment. They also come to cities to be able to find adequate housing that's provided with basic services, as you can see in this remarkable photograph from Hong Kong. This has been done before. Singapore is a classic example, which has done this in 20 or 30 years, as is Brazil. And of course, the most remarkable experience has been China, that has taken an entire generation out of poverty through the processes of urbanization and growth in less than 20, 25 years. And then once you've got the housing and you've got the employment in place, you need to provide adequate water supply and sanitation, this wonderful project out of Bangkok. You have to have food, wonderful example here from Vancouver. And then, of course, to make this possible, you need renewable energy. Copenhagen is a great example within Europe, which took a lead in this process, picked up by many other countries in the world. And then you need to have transportation systems that link labor markets and land markets and allow people to be able to work effectively. And this can be done dramatically and change the face of cities like Bogota. You need proper housing. This is a wonderful example from London, but you can find examples like this pretty much from across the world. And then the great power of disruptive technology. The internet and information technology gives us the ability not only to do commerce and talk to each other, but also to pull together knowledge and learning and enable innovation and change to actually run into the very functionings of the city. But the most important thing that we often forget when we look at these technical things, whether it's water or sanitation or transportation systems, is the fact that cities are places in which people live, in which their identities and their cultures enshrined. And it is this that really drives the functioning of cities. So the transformation that we're talking about is not just a technical transformation. It is fundamentally a cultural transformation, where we're taking a world that was agrarian in the 1950s, and by 2050, it becomes an urban world, a different world for us to understand. The other thing that we often forget is that throughout history, cities are places where the poor and vulnerable have found refuge, where social transformation has been enabled. It is here that the battles against slavery, the battles for universal suffrage, the battles for human rights, and the battles for equality for women and men have been fought and will be fought in the future. We must not forget this, because these have all grown from urban movements. These are struggles that we've really fought very hard to deal with. So we have to be able to reach out to a new social compact to underpin this entire process, a social compact that integrates into it intergenerational equity. It's not only about ourselves, it is about our children and our children's children. And we are building cities for ourselves, but also for people who come after that. And if we need to deal with that, I think one of the most serious challenges that we have to deal with is the idea of consumption, that we can consume as much as we can, and our needs and our wants are more than anybody else's in the world and more than anybody else's in the future. We need to address this, because if we don't, this is what we get. This is after the earthquake in Haiti. This is the impact of the kind of civilization that we have, the kind of cities that we build and run. The other part of this compact is actually dealing with the dichotomy between the urban and the rural. Historically, cities and villages have been seen in contrast with each other. They've been seen as opposites. In actual practice, in the 21st century, in a networked world, cities and villages are dependent on each other. They link to each other. You cannot have a sustainable city without sustainable agriculture and rural prosperity. This is a new idea, and I think we're going to be able to try and implement this over the 21st century. We also have to address the question of the environment and us. The environment and us are not separate from each other. They're tied to each other. The idea that the environment lies outside us and can absorb all of what we produce and never give anything back to us, like climate change, is an idea that came from frontier cultures that does not work in a world that is full of people. We have a world now which has 9.3 billion people in about 20 years' time. It's a world that was empty that's now full. We must reimagine our economies, our lives, and our cities as places that live on a very fragile planet. It is only then, and in that reimagination, that we can find the balance between ourselves and nature and actually reconnect with who we really are. We have at our hand remarkable gifts. We have the gift of technology, we have the gift of knowledge, and we have the gift of tremendous wealth, at least in some parts of the world. We must and have to bring that to bear, not only in our own environments, because it's easy to do that in places that are relatively rich and well-endowed, but also in other places in the world, because we are now completely connected. This is a world that is full of people, that is finally networked together, that has the opportunity to make dramatic changes. And in that, cities have a very special place. A place not only of production and consumption and the end of poverty and things like that. It is a place in which we celebrate life. We celebrate all of human culture, as you can see in this wonderful example in Marrakesh, of an open place, a celebration of how life is, or from this great place in a city that comes from India, the city of Varanasi. This is a shot along the Ghats. This is one of the oldest cities in the world that has had continuous inhabitation. Or this great example of celebration in Barcelona. So cities are a place of culture, of celebration. I think it is time that we use them as places to celebrate life. But of course, the question then is, how do you implement these ideas? How do you make that happen? Because each city is different, it has a different context, it's almost like a different person. Do you actually work bottom up with hundreds of millions of households and allow that change to happen? Or do you actually work top down with the nation states of the world and the large corporations? The challenge, of course, is there are very few places in the world that are able to do all of the wonderful things that I've talked about. The challenge for us is to take those places and first multiply them 10 times, and then 100-fold to reach a tipping point, which we can find in the next 20 or 30 years, to transform not only our environments and ourselves, but the world as we know it. The United Nations next year has a dramatic opportunity as we reach out to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I said reach out to all people everywhere. It's an opportunity for renewal, an opportunity to build a new compact between countries, cities, citizens, national, state, and local governments. What I'm encouraging people to do is to conceive of a world in which a new compact between roughly 200 countries and 2,000 cities can actually affect the change. It is this that will strengthen the countries, and of course, because cities are relatively less empowered than countries, enable us to build a way to actually make this happen. What are the impacts that we can expect from that? Education and healthcare universally available to all 5 billion urban citizens by 2030. 1 billion people who currently live in slums, and maybe a few more, who live in secure housing with adequate services. Most important, especially in Europe, 600 million meaningful new jobs with better working conditions. This is the heart of this revolution. Building resilience and addressing informality in work in a $90 trillion urban economy. A challenge that we have never met in all of our history before that. But within that, I think the real challenge, the challenge of humanity for us, is to make our cities more compassionate and inclusive, because it is in that we have the great opportunity for change, for transformation. Some people would think that this is impossible. We said the same thing of the end of slavery between the 18th and the 19th century. We said the same thing about the end of absolute monarchies between the end of the 19th and the 20th century. We had said the same thing a long time back when there was a debate about the heliocentric or the geocentric theory of how the universe was constructed. You can see our image of Earthrise from space. My contention is that as we turn from the 20th to the 21st century, the big transformation, the big impossibility is cities. Cities hold the great opportunity for us to transform ourselves, to transform society, our economy, our relationship with the environment, and in that sense, transform development. The choice of which trajectory we take is up to us. But the challenge is we cannot wait any longer. We have 20 years to do this in, and we have to start now. Thank you very much.